Video looks like it's going. We got sound perfect. Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Saxon and today we will be discussing intermediate camera knowledge. So today's class we're going to be learning a little bit off of what we were at last week, and I do apologize for last week. I didn't have my camera or my laptop charger with me, and so the last little bit probably got cut off there. The laptop died on me, but you only missed one slide, and that was just my contact information. So you got the bulk out of everything from intro to cameras. But in intermediate cameras, we're going to be going over the basics of manual operation of the camera. So we'll be looking at f-stop, we'll be looking at shutter speed, we'll be looking at ISO. We're going to talk about each one of those individually, and then we're going to bring them all back together and talk about that. We'll look at some example images that I have here and discuss how I'm kind of reading the image and kind of guessing what numbers were being used or what settings on the camera. And then lastly, we'll explore lenses. We'll talk about the trinity of lenses, the 3 most recommended lenses and why they're the most important, and then how to look at lenses and understand millimeter size. So let's jump right into it. Let me go over this way, and let me tuck this. Perfect. That way I can see the chat. As always, if anybody has any questions online, feel free to answer or call out anything in the chat. And then same thing, if you got any questions, feel free to answer or ask out. I do have one student in class today for anybody online watching. So let's jump into it. So now, kind of going back on last week, why do we go advanced point and shoot DSLR or mirrorless? You know, we have cell phones nowadays, and as you know, most people know, iPhone now has a 48 megapixel phone camera. Samsung has the highest at 108 megapixels, and now Google has a 50 megapixel camera with theirs. But what's the reason? Why do we want to advance? And the reason is simple. It's we want to get better images. We want better quality. There's something that we're looking for that the phone, maybe our tablet, maybe even the little GoPro that we have, whatever it is, just can't do it. You look at sensor sizes, and that's one of the big things that you look at when you look at advancing your camera from your phone to an advanced point and shoot DSLR mirrorless. The sensors become significantly bigger, and from there, not only do the megapixels become stronger, but we're able to read more information on the images and crop down, if you will, if need be. So going advanced doesn't necessarily equate to always getting better pictures, but it will give you the tools to take better pictures. And that's where we then learn how to use those tools. So the first thing I like to talk about is a snapshot and a photograph. And I use this as a kind of an example. When you're using a DSLR, mirrorless, or digital camera, it's really easy to just point the camera and take a clean photo. When we look at this image of the escalators, this is here at Apt Electronics. It's over on the right side. As you go up to our mattress area, we have this cool mural of Chicago, or light-up display of Chicago on the ceiling. When you're walking through, I took this quick picture with my camera, and then I took another one to kind of detail what it can look like if you just play with the settings of your camera. This is not edited. I just basically did a manual control of my camera. I lowered the exposure down. I controlled my aperture down to a 1.4. I brought ISO up to, I believe, 300 or 400. And I shot at a pretty low shutter speed because I was keeping it in the center there. But you can see the detail, you can see the color really come through, and I also made sure I framed it up nicely. But when you're taking a snapshot, it's a quick image. Maybe it's a reference photo for something that you want to do, but it's meant to be a snap. It's not meant to really be thought out. Where a photograph, depending on the subject matter and depending what you want, you can make it as moody as you want. You can make it as light or effervescent as you want. You can capture angles, lighting, shadows. There's so much that you can control on an image, or you can let go, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So first and foremost, for anybody new to this, learn your camera. These are the 3 main series that you'll see: Canon, Nikon, Sony. There's multiple cameras in each lineup, and it's important to know what your camera is. These are generalized classes that I'm teaching, so they're not necessarily focused on one model or the other. Most cameras, if not all cameras, will act the same. given they all have the same manual controls. It just might be features or specs on each of these cameras that differ from model to model. But going through it, things to look at too when you're getting more into this, editing software is a good thing. The first step will be obviously the manual control of your photos. But going from there, once you're getting better with the actual shooting, now it comes down to editing. Adobe makes really great products, Photoshop and Lightroom. My recommendation, if you have a couple photos that you'd like to truly alter, change the kind of demographic of the image or change up all the tidbits of it, use Photoshop. You'll get more out of it. There's more features. There's a lot more ability to crop and take things out. And now with generative AI in Photoshop, it's pretty incredible with what you can do. But if you're really just after changing color, lighting adjustments, and you want to edit on a more of a mass scale, I think Lightroom is the best for that. Lightroom gives you all the same features that Photoshop will, minus a few, but it'll give you the main nitty-gritty of what you need to really change or edit your photos. Capture One Pro and Corel Paint Shop Pro are both great programs as well too. They're more focused on the photo aspect and less on video. Same thing with Photoshop and Lightroom. So those are two great resources to look into. I've played with Corel, not as much Capture One, but I've seen videos and people seem to really like Capture One Pro. It's a one-time payment too with both of those, whereas Lightroom and Photoshop you do a monthly subscription as well. I don't know what the prices are on those two, but that's what I've read online. Now, before we start talking about the different modes and how we get there, we should talk about the mode dial itself. I like to refer to this as the gear shifter on your car. This is how you're basically driving the whole camera. This controls what setting that you're on and how the camera is going to allow you to then operate the camera. So the main modes that we're going to be talking about, or that you'll see on a camera, are automatic, program auto, aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual. Automatic's pretty self-explanatory. The camera drives for you. You either just control the focal length of your lens. You can also control the ISO on automatic, depending if you have auto ISO turned on. But for the most part, the camera's controlling depth of field, it's controlling speed of the shutter, and it's controlling your lighting if you allow it for the ISO. Program auto is very similar, but with program auto, whatever settings that you leave your camera to last on, it'll continue to operate on just those settings. So for example, if you have your ISO set to 200, your aperture is now set to, let's say, 1.4 or 2.8, and you've got shutter going automatically, every time you turn the camera back to program auto, it'll leave off on those exact settings. So it'll still shoot automatic if you choose to leave things at automatic, but you can program things on there to do otherwise. Aperture priority, you're just controlling the aperture. Shutter, you're just controlling the shutter. And then full manual, you're doing everything. So that's the full drive mode of the camera, where you're controlling things or setting things to automatic dependingly too. Just remember that kind of the difference between using things on full manual and program auto is if you leave full manual and you go somewhere else, the camera will naturally shift to whatever it is. So if it's automatic, everything you were doing on full manual will change. Whereas if you go then back, or if you go to program auto, switch around for a little bit, then go to something else, come back, it'll stay the same. So full manual will change after you've moved to a different setting. But the main things that we're controlling within those settings are these three things: aperture, shutter, and ISO. We'll break each one down individually, but this is how to look at them on the grander scale of things. And it's important to remember that each one affects one another. I have a customer who is a birder, and she bought one of the nicest Sony cameras you can get. It's the A9, it's their flagship model. And one of the things that she struggles with, and we talk about this all the time, is that when you are using ISO and you're using this stuff and you're switching your shutter count, it's important to keep in mind that when you change your shutter, that shutter speed is going to affect your aperture. So having an f32 at a shutter speed of 1 1,000th, it's going to make your image turn out really dark, because number one, your aperture is small, so you're not letting in a lot of light. Your shutter speed is also closing at a very fast rate, so it's not allowing a lot of light to come in. And then depending where your ISO is, if it has to jack itself all the way up because you're using auto ISO, then you're going to get a grainy image. And those are things that we'll talk about or you'll see as we go forward. But it's important to remember that depending on the priority mode that you're on, if you are on your aperture shutter priority, you're only controlling one and you only need to focus on one. The camera then will adjust by itself to naturally make up for whatever change you made. And you can see it. If you set to one of those modes and you look at your screen and you start skipping through, you'll see that it naturally changes. Hi there, welcome in. Good to see you. So, remembering that with...
I can block you if I sit here? Oh, that's fine.
Remembering that with each three of these, or each one of these, they all will act on their own, but they'll all act together as well too, depending on the setting or the mode that we're in. So first one off the bat, aperture priority. Aperture priority, I like to look at as your foreground to background separation. It can also be looked at as depth of field. With aperture, when we look at the very bottom one, we'll start at the bottom right corner. We're looking at an f1.4. On your lens, sometimes you'll have an aperture control ring that'll allow you to shift between that. Other times it'll be on the physical dial on the top part of your camera. f1.4, if you have a lens that can go that low, will separate your foreground from your background, focusing in on your subject matter. So in this case, we have a scene shot of a person standing in front of the pyramids. When we look at the f1.4, the pyramids are completely blurred out or gone. We can refer to this effect as bokeh. As we continue to move up and we change that aperture, we're slowly starting to change the depth of field on the camera, slowly giving more towards the background. So a good example of maybe where we would use aperture could be a vacation photo. Let's say that you've got the family in front of a monument or a really awesome scene. You might want to use an f22 on that one so you get the entirety of it, because the context of the photo might be important for why they're standing on a bridge or what have you. But let's say now you just maybe had a newborn kid or a grandkid. You don't really care about the hospital or maybe the garments that are around the kid. You want to focus on the kid. So using an f1.4 blurs the rest of the, let's say, negative space or non-usable space and focuses in on our main subject matter.
She also get movement too, don't she, with this?
You can. Movement.
I mean, water that looks like it's blurry and or current, or
That can occur, yeah, with the aperture setting on there. A lot of the movement you'll see will be in the exposure of the image as far as speed goes. So shutter is a really good example, and we'll talk about the one, it's the bulb setting on there where you can do long exposure with your camera, letting it sit for maybe like 10-15 seconds. As long as it's not moving, it'll get a really crisp movement on like the water and everything else, and then lock in really nice colors on your on the rest of the image that didn't move.
I can remember years ago making a camera with a pinhole, the little thing, everything's in focus, you let it expose it for a minute and a half. Right?
Yeah. It's incredible with all that, and it's exactly the same thing. And they can do it now too, where you set it on top of the tripod and you let it run for, I've had some friends do long exposures of moonshots. Those are really popular. If you can position your camera and you have enough clarity, so I'd say like a 1.4, 1.8, maybe like 80 millimeter, 75 millimeter lens, you point that guy towards the moon on a tripod, let it go for maybe like 2 minutes, you can see every little detail. And especially if you have a high megapixel camera count too, you can zoom in and see the craters really well. That's how they do most of the astrophotography. They'll do very long exposures, but as long as you have it on a base that doesn't move and there's nothing else, you don't pick up any other interference. The only issue with doing long exposures after a long period of time is it can damage the camera's sensor over time, because you're allowing the camera sensor to basically keep itself wide open for a very long period of time. So it can kind of set burn-in on the sensor, very similar to like with the TVs, how you can get, if you watch CNN all the time, you can get burn-in on like the right corner of the TV where that CNN logo looks like it's stuck. You get the same thing with that long exposure stuff.
Never noticed it.
Yeah, it could happen. But going back into the aperture settings, when we look at aperture, depending on the lens type that you have, typically if you have one of the best telephoto lenses that your camera can get, it would stop at a 2.8. 2.8 is usually the lowest you can go. Commercially, you'll see 20 to 70s. You'll see 70 to 200s. Those are usually going to be at that 2.8 mark if it's their top of the line glass. Other ones you'll see an f4, or you'll see a moving variable one from 3.5 to 5.6, etc. But on a lens, if you're able to get down to that 1.4, realistically you should be able to negate the background out completely and really just focus in on the subject matter, or on the flip side, get the entirety of it. All lenses can go up to that f22, or if they have a higher one, some cap out at f16 I've seen. But for the most part, they're both going to be very similar. You're allowing that the camera can basically catch the entirety of the scene, or you're negating everything so that way you're only focusing on the subject matter. Some examples I have of that. So on the left side, you got the dog nose. If you look at the dog in the background, you can clearly make out that's a dog, but you can't really make out any other expression. You can't tell if it's looking straight at you, looking ahead. So I'd probably put that in if I had to look maybe at like an f5.6, maybe an f8. The clarity is on the dog's nose in the front. And then for the squirrel, we've got something similar too. You got main focus in on the squirrel, you can see it in detail, but as you look into the background, you can make out the colors and the shapes, so you can tell it's probably more shrubbery or tree line of some sort. So that's probably closer to that f1.4 to 1.2.
Makes for a great picture.
Exactly, exactly. So that's kind of what we're looking at when we look at something like this. What does controlling the f-stop really do for us? It gives us that control over background to foreground separation. The other thing we can get out of it is what's called bokeh. Bokeh is a really nice effect where when you're focusing in on your subject matter, depending on what you have back behind it, lights are a very famous thing, you get bokeh dots. And the bokeh dots go across the screen. You could tell that with this is probably some Christmas lights behind it. And then you got the little minifigure in the front of it. But now, why do we want to use aperture priority mode? So that's just our A on the camera, not the automatic, but just that A on the mode dial. And a scene like this might be why. If you're going in between something where you're going to have the background looking amazing and you want to be able to get that shot, but then you have something in the subject matter that you might want to maybe focus in on and get rid of the rest, having the ability to change your aperture on the go and allowing your camera then to adjust everything by itself might be the more appropriate. One parent came in a while ago, they were getting ready for prom season in the spring, and they were asking about what to do with their camera. And I had recommended using aperture priority because she had told me, we're going to be taking photos in the same spot, we're not moving into different locations, or like going in and outdoors and stuff. We're staying outside the whole time, but we're going to be taking pictures, I think, at the Botanic Garden, something like that. So we'll be in front of this flower, or we'll be in front of that tree, and then we're going to be in front of this wall. What do you recommend? And that's where then I kind of told her the aperture priority mode, being able to then negate the background if needed, or focus in and bring the background in.
If you're in that mode, I've been playing with the camera trying to figure it out, but I've noticed in the program mode and the automatic mode, if I want to do the composition dial, the exposure composition dial, it will not work in automatic.
It will not.
So if I'm in aperture priority, it'll work.
It will work. In automatic, they give you the very basics, so they really only let you control your focus. In some cases, they don't even let you control your focus zoning. They only give you the wide zone. Maybe they give you like 1 point zone, but usually they give you the wide zone, that's it. The big thing they don't give you control over is your exposure compensation, and then your, one more. It's not focus, it's...
Your metering?
The metering's one of them. There's one other one.
Color?
No, it'll pop up in the side. It'll just randomly come to me, and I'll just shout it out. But that's one of the things you can't control on there. Yeah. So as soon as you switch to one of the aperture priority modes, or the shutter priority mode, or full manual, now you can control that. So now you can change it. If you're on automatic, it's going to take over. But if you move to those other priority modes, now you're giving yourself control. So now the camera gives you that control back.
So I'm sorry. So if I turn it to aperture, then I can control the compensation dial still?
Yes. Yes. If you're in auto, though, no control.
Yeah. Got it. That's in auto. That's the only mode that You have no control, basically.
No control. No, the only thing you're controlling is the millimeter focal distance if you have a variable lens. So to review again, when you're shooting, this camera can go all the way to f32. The lowest it can go is f2.8. When you're looking at f32, you can see the tree bark, you can see the branch, you see the water, the grass, and then you can see the parking lot with the trash can. As you start to blur that background out, you see the main focus area, so the main foreground of the image, which is the tree. That's what's in main focus right now. But then everything behind it is blurred out. Now that little bit of garbage can that we would have seen is now basically gone. It's a blurred image. You know what your main focus is, but everything else behind it starts to fade away. The next thing to talk about is shutter speed. So shutter speed is going to equate to the speed at which your shutters in your camera are closing. Now, even with a digital sensor on mirrorless cameras, there is a shutter that is enacting in your camera that is processing the image and cutting it in a way. In this, everything that we're looking at is of a second of time. So 1 in 500ths of a second, 1 in 250ths of a second, 1 in 125ths of a second, and so on and so forth. When we look at this image, we should be looking at the fact that the person is supposed to be running. So the faster our shutter speed is going, the easier or the more clarity that we have when getting the subject matter. So at 1 in 500ths, 1 in 2500 or 250ths, and 101 in, I hate these numbers, 125, we'll just go with that. When you look at those, they all look pretty clean. You don't see any blurriness. I will say you can notice that the stick figure progressively gets kind of chunkier as it goes. And that's going to be because as the camera's starting to go slower, it's reading the image slower. And because of that, if it moves a little bit, the camera will pick it up. Now, once we get to that 1/60th of a second, 1/30th, that's where we can slowly now start to see the blur in the image. And now as we then get even slower on the shutter release, we can see how much of the image is blurred. So the slower that we shoot the camera, the harder it is it's going to be to pick up movement. But the slower that we shoot the camera, the more detail we can pick up, the more light that we're letting in, the more our image gets more information.
Does it get more intense in color too?
It can, yeah, absolutely. And that's where long exposure is really amazing. And I think I have an example of one of those where you can really see on the waterfall the moss on the rocks, where it's that green color that just pops. Shutter speed is important not only for the long exposure, but for freezing action. So for example, if you're shooting sports, typically you're at 1 in 1,000th or faster on that shutter speed. So in this case, this would have probably been shot with more like 1 in 1250 or 1 in 1500th of a second, just given how fast the water is moving, everything else. But when you look at it, the surfer himself is in perfect clarity. We can see him. The water has the mist around it, meaning that the water is still moving faster than what we're capturing the camera at. But because the main focus of the subject matter was our surfer, this speed of the camera was perfect, and it was able to get him in full clarity, or at least in enough clarity that there's not a lot of movement. And the movement that we're seeing, or the blurriness, is in the water.
How does the camera pick up the surfer instead of the water?
That'd be
Focus.
That'd be the focusing type. So on some of these cameras, I know on like mine right now, I have the ability to switch between people, birds, dogs, animals in general, and then planes and trains. It gives me planes and trains. My camera specifically has modes on there where the camera's AI is looking for this. So in the case of the camera, most of the time their ability to detect people comes down to the shape. They can make out by either skin color or body shape or just positioning. The camera's AI figures that out and it can focus around them. When I'm shooting with my camera, one of the first things I just noticed, I got a new camera. I was pointing the camera, started focusing in, actually puts a perfect box around my dogs, and I have St. Bernards. So they're big dogs, 200-pound dogs. It's not like it's a small little guy. And my camera was able to recognize that. And then I pulled back, and I was just getting a shot of their head. Well, the way that their skin, I'll show you images later, the way their skin kind of droops on their eyes, you don't get clear images of their eyes. When I was focusing in with the camera, it put a perfect box around its eye.
So you couldn't use the animal eye focus?
Oh, I could, and it was still able to detect them. And what I'm saying is basically that the camera was
Recognizing.
so yes, recognizing to a rate that I didn't think it would have been able to, just given the variables. So the camera's smarter than we give it credit for. The other thing we might want to use with this is giving a sense of motion. So in this case, we have a freeze frame image. It's probably shot at least in 1/1250th of a second or in 1/1000th of a second. But the bird's body is in perfect clarity. The beak has a slight blurriness to it, but the yellows, the browns, the greens, and then all of the other like white parts of the fur of the feathers, those are clean. As we move to the physical wings, we can tell that those are in motion, and we see the blur within there. So we freeze framed the physical body, but we're giving a slight sense of motion to the wings that doesn't distract us too much from the physical image itself, but it gives more context that this bird just wasn't chilling on a branch, or that it's not a dead bird hanging up in the field museum.
And you can get all of this with speed priority?
Yes.
And the camera will recognize it and create this shot?
Exactly. Depends on number one, too, the lens that you're using. If you're using something that's more of a kit lens, you might not get the exact clarity of this, obviously, but the science is there. If you have the speed set where you're now focusing on the shutter moving at a faster rate, on shutter priority, the camera should then adjust everything else to that shot so that the only thing you're focused on is the speed.
So speed priority, I have to set it, right? I have to go, maybe I want 1,000, right?
Exactly.
Right?
Yep. So when you go on that mode dial, switch to the S, that's the shutter priority, and then you'll find the dial that controls the shutter speed. If you're holding it up in the viewfinder, you can actually see in the bottom of this viewfinder what the shutter speed is. It'll show you as you're kind of ticking through. If you're looking at the physical screen on the camera, it should also be on the very bottom.
And then just knowledge, so you're taking sort of pictures and you go, I gotta go faster than that.
One of the things I talk about in intro to photography, one of my favorite buttons on the camera is the playback and info button on your camera, and everybody has it. If you're shooting in automatic, shoot as many shots as you want, take all the pictures, and when you're getting ready to look at them, hit the info button on one of your favorite ones. On the automatic setting, it'll actually show you in the info what stats you used. So if you're shooting in auto, and let's say you're like, wow, the lighting was perfect there, it was a semi-cloudy day, I wonder how my camera did that. If you click the info button, it'll tell you those stats.
And remember it, so
exactly, and that's the key with photography in the most part, is it's a lot of touch and feel. You can use automatic and the camera's going to take a really great photo, but if you're trying to master it, there's no one way to look at it. There's 3 different variables. There's light, motion, and your foreground and background. That's really the 3 things that are going on right here when we talk about this, and that's the 3 things the camera basically is fighting at all times. If you're taking still images or like still photography of maybe architecture or landscapes, you kind of get a cheat with that, because now motion is out of the picture. Now your main thing is depth of field and lighting, and obviously composition plays a big part in all this. But yeah, it's all about that general knowledge and that experience. That's why I tell people, take 1,000 photos, and even then you're still going to have questions. But now we're talking about long exposures. So when we look at long exposures, we're allowing the camera's sensor to be fully open for a prolonged period of time. And by doing that, we're oversaturating the camera with information, color, and just all of the different stuff that goes into taking a photo. So with this one, you can see the movement, and the movement's in the water. The water's not still, it's a bouncing reflective surface, so you'll see that it moves in all sorts of different directions. You have this haziness over the whole thing. But when you look at the rocks and you look at the leaves and the foliage, you can see how vivid the colors are, you can see the sharpness on there, you can see the definition, and that naturally comes in because you let your camera sit for a longer period.
Got to be using a tripod to get that.
100%, because if there's any wiggle in your photo, you're going to see it immediately and it'll look bad.
What would you guess the speed would be on that?
Maybe a 15 or 20 second exposure.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an extreme long period of time. You don't have to sit there for minutes and minutes, but in order to get that amount of information,
Will this camera go that slow?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
So you can go in there, and there should be 2 different ones. There's bulb, and then there's also just your regular speeds. Bulb will be if you press it once, it'll stay open until you press it again. I'm okay with that one, but how hard you click it, if you click it too hard, the camera will shake. So you can then change it and you'll see it. Usually it'll tell you the number, so it'll say like 10 seconds, and then it'll have like a parentheses next to it to call out that it's, or quotation marks to call out that it's in seconds. So yeah, you can go as long as you want.
Get stronger light, stronger colors too.
100%. 100%. So then that's where it's important to realize what your ISO is at, and then what your aperture is at, because then now you're talking about depth of field, and you're talking about that color. What I might do if you're starting to do long exposures is, I don't have as much experience with taking them, but what I might recommend is just looking up to see what people are using for their ISO on there, just so that way you don't overpower your camera.
You know, and too many years ago, but ISO, you'd buy a roll of film and you'd have an ISO and you'd set your 100%. Camera on that, and that was it,
that was it. That was it. Yep.
So now, can I adjust the ISO?
Yeah, you can change it at any time. So that's the exact way to think about it. When you had film, the number that was written on the film, that was the number that your film was at. So it was Kodak 100, Kodak 400, or Protoplane. What I forgot the one name for the roll. Yeah, but it was one of those things where, it would tell you right away, and you knew exactly what the sensitivity of that was going to be, so your only focus was going to be how much light you had in the room to make sure you had enough there, but then how fast your camera was going to close on that image, and then how wide your lens was going to be open. Those are only two things.
When would I use the ISO as opposed to the speed to get that shot?
So that's where ISO is funny, because there is no ISO priority method. On the camera, you have two options. You can either set it to auto, or you can change the number at any time. ISO comes into play when we talk about it next, because we're going to basically see the brighter that you, or the higher you turn your ISO, the more accepting of light you are telling your camera to be. So by doing that, you can make the photo become very, not pixelated, but what's the term I'm looking for? Oh man.
Washed out.
No, it can look washed out. No, it can look. Oh man, I even say it in there.
Whatever.
It'll come up. It's gonna come up. But regardless, ISO, it's gonna be your sensitivity to light. It does have an effect on the vividness and the color, but not as much as it has an effect on how much light that the camera is intaking. So if you're in a dark situation, having your ISO higher than normal is probably a better thing, because if you only are taking a picture and there's only one street light, where you got can lighting, like in this case, you want the ISO to be a little bit higher so you can pick up noise.
Would the exposure composition dial accomplish the same thing as the...
Those two, so exposure compensation and ISO are two separate things, but they work very similarly. ISO is controlling your camera's overall sensitivity towards light. So if you are in an area where you've got can lighting, or maybe now you're going down by the atrium and you've got the sunlight coming down, you're putting yourself in different lighting situations. ISO can adjust your camera to then take the most optimized picture for that. Exposure compensation takes the frame as a whole, and it'll either make it slightly darker or slightly lighter. So it's not necessarily, the two can play. So if you change your exposure compensation, it should alter your ISO, but they're two separate things. And it's, I forgot, there's a very nerdy way of putting it too, where it's the spectrum of light at which ISO is monitoring, and the spectrum of light at which exposure compensation is monitoring. ISO is basically looking for like what your histogram is. That's that kind of weird chart that flows where you've got a light area, a dark area, and then the neutral ground. You can, on your camera's display, on almost all of the new modern ones, you can switch now to have it show on there. So it'll be a little box, and it'll basically be like a topographical map.
I don't know how you read that.
I know, trust me, I'm still figuring it out. It's basically, you're looking for it to be, I'd have to draw it out. And in the advanced class, I know I talk about it, basically goes up really high at one point, comes down in a valley, and then peaks up like halfway as high as the high point. And that basically means that your lights are the highest they can be, but they're a normal height. Your neutrals vary, but then they peak back up at the black. But the black isn't overpowering your light colors, so you have a nice kind of variety of neutral colors, extreme darks, and extreme lights. Regardless, though, the histogram is more of what the ISO is controlling, and exposure is looking at the whole frame as a whole and basically being like, oh, I can make it lighter or darker.
Yeah.
So I like to look at exposure compensation as your cheat code when you're playing in dark situations. If you're taking a photo and it looks too dark and you've already set your ISO, you've done everything else, change the exposure compensation. If you're putting yourself in a brand new situation and you've got to adjust your aperture and your shutter, you might as well just change your ISO while you're at it too.
One more question on this. So if
Yes.
this is 15 or 20-second exposure for blowing the water stuff, but the color, you're saying it's much richer in the colors.
Yes.
If you took the same photo at 1/25th of a second, captured, still shot of the water, how much of a effect does it have on the colors? It's probably hard to describe. I just didn't realize you got richer colors.
You're gonna get, yeah, basically, because what you're doing is you're giving more information to the physical camera, and so from there it's going to continue to look. Because even if I flip this, I don't know if you can see on my end, because I know on the screen it looks one way, but if you look over here, like you can even kind of see on my image how dark, how much more dark. You could probably achieve this also by editing the photo. But there is something about doing it just doing it in longer exposure that might more appeal to other people, or it just kind of
More natural.
Yeah, more natural. I don't know. Maybe it just creates something a little bit different.
More depth of color, the shadows are richer.
Exactly. Naturally, by allowing this to stay open for longer, there's more information that it can take in. Being that you're both shooting on Canon, that has one of the best color profiles in the camera industry. So doing the longer exposure should bring more of those color properties out. Because I believe in RAW photos you shoot at 24-bit color, and even at JPEG I think you're shooting at 16-bit color. So that's a pretty big gambit of color, or gamma of color. I forgot what the term is. So the longer that it's going, naturally the more that color is going to start to kind of pull forward. Less editing you might necessarily have to do. But if you really want to get down to it to save yourself the time, that 125th, and then just edit it on Lightroom, you're probably going to get the same effect. Or you can at least bring those color profiles out, if you will.
Do you, does one of your classes show you how to use Lightroom?
I don't really talk, my advanced photography one does talk about the settings that are in there and how to work them, but none of them I don't really demonstrate.
You don't
how
do
to.
that. You
no.
don't have it. Okay.
I use it myself sparingly, so I know how to use it. And so what I tell people, and I know we had done this, if you have it, I can kind of walk you through and show you some of the stuff.
Yeah, I got a bunch of questions later. So
Don't worry. Ask at any point. I got time.
Well, all right, you mentioned JPEG and RAW, right? So if you're doing RAW, then you do the editing yourself?
You should, yeah. I mean, you can edit a JPEG too, and in the advanced class, this gets brought up. That's next week too, so you might want to come for that one. The way I describe it is that a JPEG comes in as a compressed file. It's going to be a smaller file on your camera's SD card.
Take more pictures.
In more pictures with it, and technically, they already process it for you. So a JPEG is a processed image that's compressed. A RAW photo is a non-compressed image. It might generally look a little bit more muted on the physical camera itself after you've taken the photo. It doesn't look as vivid. But then from there, it has a larger color gambit, one of the two. It has a larger color spectrum. And so you can basically change and edit a lot more, and you can make things more vibrant or more, non-vibrant if you want.
So if I'm not versed at all on editing, so I should be shooting JPEG, right? I mean, until I get really better.
I would absolutely recommend that, yeah.
Fine.
Because the photos themselves will have the better, at least color for right now, compared
compressed
to
JPEG or just
regular. Yeah, it'll just be a JPEG. It's just a JPEG file is compressed naturally. That's what it is. So you don't have to change anything on there.
What should I be shooting?
The other thing that you get with the shutter is long exposure. Or another example of long exposure, I should say, is this guy. This one shows. Are you okay?
The resolution with JPEG, does it,
Resolution you can choose. It's dependent on what your SD card is. I like to shoot at the highest resolution possible, so extra fine or fine, whatever it is. But you can also switch and do like a medium or a low JPEG as well too. They'll have like JPEG L, M, and H.
is there a number on the is it 24? What am I thinking?
Oh, you're thinking of the megapixels? It's whatever your cam.
No. It's on the resolution of the JPEG. Can't you set that or?
Yeah, usually it's chosen already, so it's like a high, a medium, and a low, and they'll tell you what the resolution is between all three of those. I can't think of them off the top of my head.
But you want high.
I would say high, just for yourself, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
This would be another example of what you can accomplish with long exposure, where maybe you're trying to capture movement in a really fun way. So in this case, this guy probably set it up on a bench behind him or on a tripod. The bike himself, the train platform, and the ceiling of the train platform are not moving. So we can see all of those with great detail. We see the shadow, we see the color. But when we look at this image, we can see a train that was speeding by. And what I think is really interesting is that if you really look, when the train is zipping by, it's capturing in between the train. And so because the camera isn't moving, it naturally is going to keep recording that as it goes, and it's just going to keep layering that on top of itself until that's in full clarity. There might have also been a time while he was shooting this where the train wasn't in front of him quite yet, and so it kept going. So motion is another thing that you can really get with long exposure, and you can make
I don't understand how that works.
Yeah, just again, long exposure, a very fast moving object that you can basically kind of see through in a sense because it has gaps. And then he stayed very still while all that was happening. Why use shutter priority? I think this photo is my favorite example of why you should use shutter priority. If you have anything that you are watching, doing, or taking photos of, and there's movement, this is an ultimate frisbee game downtown. If you're playing a sport or you're trying to get images of that sport, remember that your subject matter is in movement, and your camera needs to be responding to that movement, whether that be with faster shutter speed or a slower shutter speed. That choice comes from touch and feel of playing with the setting. Another example of using a faster shutter speed. So this would have been shot with maybe 12/100ths of a second or 1 1,000th of a second. Just something where it's capturing motion in the fastest form. Now let's talk about ISO. That's the last part of this whole thing. So in the exposure triangle, you have ISO. The lower the number is in ISO, the less light intake that the camera has. The higher the ISO is, the more light intake that it has. Also, the higher it can saturate colors in certain things, but also the more it can mute colors depending on how far you put it. So if we start with ISO 100 in the top left corner, the pier, the shadows that are coming from the pier, and even the color from the skyline feel dark. Everything feels dark. When we move over to 200, we're allowing more light to come through, so the orange becomes more standoutish. Now you've got less shadow building underneath the pier and on the water, and you're slowly starting to make out that might be a sandy beach right there. As you move to 400, now you can really see it. You get more purples and blues that break through. But then at 800, I feel that's where you really get to see the yellow, the orange, and the red, the pinks, the purples, the blues. You can make out the beach. And maybe if you turn the ISO up a little bit more, you'd have more light on the image just to see a little bit more.
So do you think the 800 is the best picture?
I would think the 8, I mean, at least for clarity purposes,
Yeah.
maybe the 400 would probably be a little bit more moody, but it's all dependent on the artist's choice. The other thing too is that you can change the exposure compensation of this image even after the fact too. So if you want to make it darker or lighter with exposure compensation on the image, you can edit that.
So the higher the number, the more clarity, right? And the more...
Not necessarily the more clarity, but the more light intake that it's bringing in, so the brighter or more popish your images will feel. ISO though also can equate to noise, and that's an important thing to put down as well. So when you look at ISO 100 on the left side of the Empire, I think that's the Empire State, that's a Chrysler. If you look at the ISO 100 on the Chrysler building, it's a clean image. You don't see a lot of pixelation. You don't see kind of anything harsh on the image. The color looks fine. It just is a little blurry because it's probably not a very good aperture for that distance of a shot. Now comparing that to ISO 3200, now you've got a lot of pixelation, you've got a lot of noise happening on there. So the higher your ISO goes in lit areas, the more noise, the more dust, if you will. That was the word I couldn't think of before. So noise and ISO go hand in hand, and it's important to make sure that when you're setting your ISO, you're allowing the higher numbers really to only come into effect when you're taking photos in very dark situations. I really like taking pictures of neon signs. That's, I think, really fun for me. But I don't enjoy doing it during the day, and I don't like I like doing it at night when they're on and they pop. If I'm taking a picture and I have the ISO too high, given whatever time of the night it is, the neon will naturally make all of the blacks in the sky or in my area start to look sandy. So I have to keep my ISO at a high or a lower point, but like not too low where it can't read the image, but not too high where I start to get these dots around everything. Auto ISO, and when do you want to use that? I like to recommend, number one, if you've never really paid attention to your ISO, stick with auto for right now until you kind of get an idea. Use that info button on the playback to see what your camera is naturally adjusting your ISO to. For me personally, I have two different cameras at home. I have a Fuji and I have a Sony. My Sony, I constantly am switching the ISO and changing numbers, but I generally roll with auto ISO for me personally, just because I trust the camera's judgment on the lighting situation. My main focus is my aperture control for the most part.
How do you set auto ISO, or is it?
When you're in the menu before that, usually the FN button on your cameras,
Yeah.
you can then go to where the ISO section is, or on the actual dial there should be an ISO. When you press on ISO, you should be able to turn it all the way in one direction until it gets to the A for automatic. Or you can turn it all the way in one direction until it gets to whatever other number you
And
want.
it's on the FN button, right?
Yeah, it should be right in your function menu. That's the FN. I typically like to use auto ISO because I'm not too worried about the light control of my images. On my Fuji camera, though, I want my Fuji camera to look as close to film as possible, and I've kind of established everything in my camera where my auto white balance shoots at a negative white balance so that I get a little bit more of a creamy tone in all my photos. The tint is also a little bit off in one of the gamma areas where the green level, and I have it pushed a certain way, so again it mutes the image quality in certain areas, and then I keep my ISO at 800 at all times. Doesn't matter at what time of the day, night. When I shoot my images, they look more naturally like film. They have more of a grainy texture to them.
What can you just so that's not when you use auto?
No. When I'm using my one camera, my Fuji, I always keep it set at 800 to give me this film-like quality on all my images. And I also have the color set on my camera to also mute or to bring out certain details that you would have seen on like a Kodak film or a Fujinon film or a reel or any of those. When I use auto ISO, I typically like to use it, and I had another one where a mom came in and she was getting ready for homecoming shoots, and she was telling me that they're going to go indoors and outdoors for photos, some outside, some indoors. That's when I told her to use auto ISO. If you're going to be going in and out of places where the light control isn't going to be something that you have power over, it's nice to use auto ISO. It's one less thing you have to think about. Your camera naturally adjusts, you control depth of field, and you control the speed at which the shutter is going. If you do want to control it, ISO 100 is typically going to be your everyday use. Some people will turn it up from there, but I would say majority of the time when you've got a good amount of light outside and sun looks good, ISO 100 is perfect. Can lighting, situations like this, that's probably where you'd want to go to like an ISO 800, maybe an ISO 500 or 6. Anything past that should really be when you're in more nighttime situations. Where you don't have good lighting, or you have one light that's yards away. That's something to keep in mind too, is distance of light when you're doing this stuff. The higher you put your ISO when a light is further away, the more sensitivity you'll have and hopefully bring stuff out. But again, it's that balance between noise and non-noise. So reviewing it all one more time. Aperture, that's your control over your depth of field. My little stuffed pigs here kind of give the example, but if you look at f/16, if you look closely, you can see the entire frame there, As you move down to f1.4, the couch in the background that we see starts to get fuzzier and more blurred. Move down to that shutter speed, that's a hammer that's swinging, hitting a nail. As we start to lower the speed and go slower and slower, we start getting more blur on the physical hand hitting the hammer. The other thing that you can see as it gets slower is that the frame gets darker. So we start to take away light, because as we're shutting the camera faster, we're also changing the amount of light that comes in. So that's where ISO will get adjusted, or f-stop will get adjusted if you're using that priority. Same thing if you're using the aperture priority. As you change those, the camera's naturally going to need to change its shutter and its ISO to make up for the fact that you want to shoot in f1.4. Because the f1.4 makes your iris of your lens really, really tiny, so therefore you're going to need more light coming in. You're going to need more saturation coming in order to make up for that. Now when we look at ISO on the other side, when we look at ISO 100, we can see the copper of the penny, we can see the shine on there, and then when we look at the finish on the wood, you can see it's a darker wood material, you can see the grain in there, everything else. As you start to turn your ISO up, the copper of the penny becomes more muted in color, becomes a little bit more light. The wood itself too starts to become more washed out, and by the time you get to 2500, you can really see it's pixelated. We call that noise or chatter on the image. It's kind of like the stuff that's in the TV when it goes fuzzy. It's the same thing, but now it's over your whole image, and that's because you've left your sensor too sensitive to the light, and therefore it's going to wash out those colors because it's trying to pull in all of this light when it doesn't need to. So thinking back on the long exposures, for long exposure it's probably important to keep your ISO at the level of 100 and allow the camera to pull in all of the light that it can, rather than oversaturate your image, turn on your long exposure, and then now your camera's taking in way too much at a time. It'll probably wash the whole image out and
So
make it
100 is a good general.
I think 100, yeah. Well, 100% is the good general, kind of stick at that one. Now, depending on your light situation, you're probably going to have to turn it up. But yeah, 100 I would say for a sunny day or a nice day outside, even a little overcast, it's probably going to be what you're mainly using. Indoor photography, can lighting, that's probably where I want to go 250, 400 right now.
Oh, okay, for...
I'm just looking at the lights right here, right? They're warm. It's not a cold Kelvin. It's a warm Kelvin temperature on there. The can lighting too is more recessed, so it's not coming down, so we're not getting an even spread or distribution of light in a lot of places. You've got kind of all these shadows all over the place. I feel like if you take an image with this with a 100 ISO, it's going to look too dark. So if you turn it up just slightly, I think you'd get more out of the image in the darker environment. Now the exposure meter a little bit. We talked about it. The exposure meter controls the entirety of the exposure of the image. It's a cheat code that kind of plays in hand with your ISO. If you change your exposure, it will change your ISO. But your ISO will change the camera's entire sensitivity, where this is just changing the frame of the image like we were talking about earlier. Depending on the brand you use, they kind of show them off a little bit different. One full stop is usually marked either by a tick mark or by the number. Typically the lower that you go on there, so into the negatives, you're going to get the darker colors. If you then start to go higher, you're going to get lighter colors. So it's a nice thing to play with depending on where you're at.
This is a
Exposure.
same thing, right? Composition dial, exposure composition dial.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Yep, this is your exposure meter, and that dial is controlling that. Full manual, we have control over both aperture and shutter speed. This is the typical camera. If you've shot with film, this is what you had to do. You had to control both of these. I always tell people that are brand new to photography, if you can use a film camera and you can use it effectively, a digital camera is going to be like having an aluminum bat after you were swinging with a wood bat for the longest time. You're going to feel the pop. So in this part of the class, and we'll blow through this since now we're kind of getting closer to the end, or the part where I want to get to questions, and we still got to talk about lenses. This is usually where I start breaking down the images and I talk about what I see based on the lighting and everything else and what I think the person might have used. So in this case, we have a pretty good scenery shot, but it's darker. So my imagination is that the f-stop on the camera would probably be a 2.8 or a 1.4. We're getting the entirety of the image, but we want to bring in a lot more light because we have a darker image. The ISO would have probably been at that 250 or 400 range, maybe at 100, but given how vivid some of the colors are, I don't think it's any higher than that. And then as far as shutter, I would probably say this is a little bit of a longer exposure. When you look at the lights on the windows of the units and even the light where that's on the bridge there, they're very bright. They're kind of flaring a little bit. So that would lead me to believe that this was a little bit of a longer exposure. Not like 125ths of a second longer. That's too short. I probably would say like maybe half a second if this was using a tripod, maybe 1/50th of a second if it wasn't.
And what was the f-stop?
I would probably 1.8 or 2.8 or 1.4 to 2.8 because depending on how dark it is outside in the shot, the sky looks lighter, but that probably is coming from the physical camera, not from it, the lack of, the street lights are on, it's dark. You'd want to have a more wide open exposure or a much more wide open aperture to bring in as much light as possible. So that's why I would lean on that one. If it was lighter outside, I probably would put it more on an f/16 or something of that nature because then you wouldn't need all of that and it would capture more of the depth of field. Here we have our cherry blossoms. Now, in this case, the aperture on this one's probably going to be a little bit lower just because of how blurred out that background is and how we're focusing in on the main branches there. I probably would put this closer to maybe like an f4, 5.6, because you can make out in the background that those are extra cherry blossoms, but you don't see them in full clarity or detail. The main is this front part. Sorry, I already did that one. ISO is probably 100 on this one just because it's sunny, it's light outside. I wouldn't expect it to be any higher. And shutter speed, unless these guys were blowing in the wind, they're probably doing a 1 and 125th of a second. That's a pretty standard shutter speed, I would say. Two firemen here, one in the background, slightly blurred out, very similar to that dog image we were looking at earlier. So I probably would say, you can tell it's another fireman, but you can't make out the facial expression or where the eyes are going. So you probably would be maybe f8. That might be too high. I'd say anywhere between let's say 4 at the lowest to maybe 8 at the highest, but I probably would go even a little bit further. I just don't want to say 2.8 or anything because you can still make out that that's a fireman behind them by the shapes and everything. ISO on this one, you can see a lot of shadows. It's a little awkward. I think a 100 would probably be fine, but maybe it's at a 250 at the highest. And then as far as shutter speed, depending if this is a more acted out scene, it's probably not fast, but if they're walking, it's probably a little bit faster. So I'd probably say 125th of a second, if not maybe 1/200th or 1/300th.
Great picture. I mean, the aperture is like, whew.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's what we're looking for in some of these, is that we want that detail on the front shot. Now we got the ram head here. A lot of detail on the ram head, not a lot in the background. But we can make out that the background is some form of icy snow kind of mixture. So I probably would say that that is a 4, 5.6. Still make out the background, but it's got blur to it. The ISO on this one is probably going to be at 250 just because it is a little darker, and I think that having a little bit of a higher ISO in this case would make some colors pop out a little bit more and make things a little bit more dramatic. Now, this is where I don't know on this image if this is a stuffed goat at like a museum or if this is a real goat. Part of me thinks it's stuffed just because the detail looks way too nice and it's such a still image.
Don't you think you should like just somebody combed his hair?
Yeah,
right?
it's just, it's very clean. So, yeah, but if this was a moving ram, I probably would say that the shutter speed would have been a little faster to make up for the fact it could have moved. But given that it's it looks like there's a lot of detail in the image, it's probably a longer exposure.
If it was a stuffed one, how would they do that and then add a second picture behind it, right?
No, like as in for the no, this could be like, you know, when you go to the field museum, sometimes they have some of those animals in their dioramas. Exactly, they might have that set up for them already if this is at a natural history museum of some sort.
Not like, remember the old with the film, you can sometimes do a
Yeah.
double exposure by mistake, right? It's
Exactly.
like,
Yep.
it's pretty cool.
I know. There's a couple cameras that give you that ability. I know Olympus actually has that in one of their cameras. You can do that where you can set it to one exposure and then you could literally take another image and then it overlays the two on top of it. It's really cool looking. Alright, this one's for speed and motion. Got two dogs playing catch. You're throwing frisbees. Right off the bat, on the left side, the background is blurred out really good. I would probably put that at a 1.2, 1.4. Just judging by the shine in the back, those are probably a row of cars back there. This is a park district and it goes a little bit further down. But the main focus is on the dog and everything else is basically gone, except for the patch of grass that it's leaping from. From there, it's in the air, it's catching something at great speed, so I would probably say 1 1,000th or faster. And then on top of that, with how sunny it is outside, placement of shadows and everything else, ISO 100 is more than enough. Maybe a little bit higher just so that way with the very fast shutter speed and the really blurred out background, they might be making the ISO a little higher just to add a little extra light into the camera because its aperture is really tiny and the speed at which it's trying to capture an image is really fast. The football player jumping into the end zone, and that's going to be a faster shutter speed for sure. You've got slight blur in the background there, but not a lot, so probably an f4, 5.6, or 8. Probably closer to 8 because you can really make out the details of the football players. As far as light goes, he's got some shadows on him, possibly from either the photographer himself or from how the football dome is situated. But I probably wouldn't picture it's more than F1, or more than 250 at the most. But yeah. Now this one, I confused myself for the longest time, but this is a long exposure shot. And the reason I can tell, if you look underneath the train pedway walkway, you'll see red stripes going across. That to me is symbolizing that light's going across this. So there was a train or something that was moving in there. Also, the lights are flaring, and really the only way you get those light flare-ups is if the camera's sensitivity is a little too high, and on top of that, it's doing a longer exposure. That's one way of getting those. So my judgment, longer exposure on here. I don't know exactly how long, so I can't give you on the shutter on that one. But as far as everything else, really the only thing in focus is the bike, and you can read the text pretty clearly. So I probably would say that's like an F6 or maybe actually probably a little higher than that, like F8, F12. On top of that too, ISO is probably going to be maybe 200, 300. And the only reason I think that is because of how bright those lights are. And then the exposure or the speed at which it was going is probably like a good 10 or 15 seconds given how those red lines are going across. Probably a little less than that because there's actually not a lot of detail on the buildings, and the color isn't that standoffish. Probably like a 5 or 4 second exposure. Keep doing that. Alright. So learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn how to use the camera. You gotta put this stuff into practice. So I always recommend to people, keep shooting with auto, but once you think you got it, it doesn't have to necessarily be when your grandkids are getting born or like when, you know, you're on that famous vacation you've been saving your life away for. But if you got maybe the dogs playing in the backyard or, you know, you're goofing around for a little bit, try one of these settings out. Experiment with it a little bit, see if you get anything out of it. But the main thing you're trying to understand is the speed at which your shutters are moving or the way at which your camera uses depth of field and how that changes. Could also be the lighting. If you're playing with ISO, it could be, you know, how does lighting affect the different areas and how does color then get changed with the lighting and how do I need to adjust my camera to make up for the fact. Those are the things that you're playing with and experimenting with that comes from learning the steps but then actually practicing with them. So my best accessories that you could ever get with this stuff, practice obviously is number one. Classes, there's so many different classes you can sign up for out there. I'm just one of them. YouTube channels are great. I think anything that I've learned, I actually was telling a customer the other day, I'm getting ready to redo my entire bathroom, and everything I've learned how to do with plumbing is from YouTube. Everything. I mean, my grandfather has no patience for any of this stuff. His recommendation would just be pay someone else to do it. I'm like, no, I like the handiwork. It's fun. I like doing my own chores. So, yeah, YouTube, awesome. You can learn everything that you want to learn. Workshops and travels. I've got a couple different workshops that come in here a lot that I think are really funny. The Chicago Botanic Gardens has a club, and they meet, I think, every 2 or 3 weeks, and their competition is literally they take pictures amongst themselves, they show it to each other. Whoever wins then, I think, is their photo gets shown in the editorial that they put out every month for the Chicago Botanic Gardens. So they compete with each other, they talk to each other, but it's really cool when they come in. I always love to see their photos and some of the flowers with these macro lenses. It's incredible, the detail of the insects that they get pictures of. It kind of freaks you out how close up they are. The other workshop group that I have that comes in is the O'Hare Club. There's a group that has special permission. They were actually just on ABC 7 or NBC 5. They have special permission from the airport. They get to wear these clearance badges, and there's a special spot on the runway they can stand, and they're allowed to take pictures of the planes landing and taking off. It's really cool, and they put on the big lenses, and they get the detail underneath. You can see like the treads on the tires of the plane as it takes off. It's really incredible. The last thing though is travel. If you're going anywhere, I hear the complaint a lot. My camera's bulky. I paid a lot of money. I don't want it to go missing. Bring it with you. Tape the logos up so that no one can see what the logo of the camera is. I always recommend that. They recommend doing that when you go to foreign countries. People don't care about the camera. They just care about the names. So if they see it's a Canon camera, they know they can sell that for money. If they just see a regular camera, they don't know if it's a new camera, bad camera, so they're not really your main threat. So tape it up, gaffer tape, duct tape, just put something to cover the logo up. That's all they look for, is the logo on your camera. And that's how they know if they want it or not. So other recommended accessories, I've gone through this before. Just for time's sake, I'll let you look at it, or I'll read through it real quick. A bag, extra battery and memory card, and a lens cleaning kit. Those are the three, and a strap. I would say those are the 4 things I think every photographer needs. If you don't have those, then you got some problems other than not having your camera or your lens. The rest of that stuff is optional accessories, but I definitely would recommend looking at it. We're going to talk about lenses next before we end the class, or then do questions. A tripod's great. External hard drive to save all your images so they're not all piled on your computer or in your iPad. Polarizer filter is great, ND filter is great, and then the additional lenses.
What is an ND?
Neutral density. So neutral density takes the kind of the light and weighs it, and so when you move in one direction, it'll basically act as a polarizing filter, and it'll make things darker by the light and by glare, and if you turn it the other way, it'll reduce.
So for outdoor, I should get a polarized
or neutral density, one of the two. Neutral densities are typically more expensive, but they can both block out UV and the polarizing lights, because that's what the polarizer does, is it helps against those UV ultraviolet rays. The neutral density then takes that and can filters the color.
So I can remember my old camera, you could take the polarizing lens and you could actually turn it on the end.
Yep.
And you could look through the lens and go, wow, I'm getting a lot more blue now.
That's the ND filter. That's what you were using before. The polarizer filter won't move. It'll stay fixed on the one spot, so you can't twist it.
If I'm an automatic, how does that, you could still look through
it. You can still change it. Yeah, because you can still change the focal length on your lens, and you can still change the color on your lens via a filter. The only thing you don't get to change when you're on automatic is the actual manual controls of the camera.
So what's a ND filter cost?
It depends. It's usually I'd say anywhere between maybe $30 to $100.
Okay.
It's all dependent on the quality of one that you get, and it's also dependent on the lens that you have. If you have a more common millimeter size, they're cheaper. If you've got a little bit of a wider mouth one, they're typically more expensive because there's more glass.
How about a hood?
Hood, you don't necessarily need one. If they don't give you one with your lens, it's typically because you don't need one. Get a filter, and that'll be just enough.
And the filter just
screws on.
Screws right on.
Yeah, on your lens there will be a number.
You guys see it there.
Yep. Whatever that number is, that's the diameter, so it'll have the line with the circle through it. Yeah, we got them here. What was I going to say? Yeah, I recommend having the filters. Even if you just get a UV filter, they're great because it'll protect the lens from getting scratched. again, if you put a lot of money into the glass of the camera, or that's actually, I think, the next slide. Yep, that's the next slide. Date your body, marry your glass. Your camera body is only as good as its shutter count. It's like the mileage on your car. The more that you take photos, the more the camera's going to slow down, the more it's not going to retain as much detail. That's natural as you keep using. It's like your cell phone, like your car, like anything. The glass, however, though, the mechanics on the glass are phenomenal, and they should last you longer, if not the rest of your life, compared to the camera. Some of these camera lenses, like with Canon, I'm curious to see the longevity in the future because they have so much technology built on the inside now, like the new RF series. Both of you have. No, you have a Sony. You have a Sony. You have a Canon. The Canon's RF series is one of the most advanced mechanisms on the inside of the lens. It has an AI, a CPU. It's incredible. Canon is the only one making the lenses right now, and I'm curious to see in the future. Canon products never really go bad really, but I'm curious to see with those lenses in the future if there's anything ever with them because of how much technology is built into them with their glass. But if you can, you should be putting a lot of money into your lenses, and you should basically be putting an even split. How much ever you spend on your camera body should be an equal amount to what goes into the physical lens. So for my example, I just bought a new camera body. Retail price on that would have been about $3,800. The lens itself, I could have bought the cheaper variation of the lens for about $600, but it would have been subpar compared to the camera. So in order to get the quality required with that camera, I needed to get the $1,250 lens. So it is still cheaper than the camera body, but the lens itself will hopefully last me for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And when I get a new camera body, I can move it over to that. And
What
have
do you
that
suppose
quality.
I'm trying to remember what, a bunch of old film cameras, and it seems like the lenses were they 55 millimeter?
It could be 50. 50 millimeter is how the human eye looks. So
This thing seems pretty heavy for me.
yeah,
Right, and it's like, okay, I mean, it zooms the whole thing, but
yeah.
I mean, is a 50 a good sort of compliment or not?
50. So we're going to talk about that next. So here, in the lens world, there's a trinity of lenses that we'll talk about at the last bit of class. But this is kind of the way we'll start with the focal length and zoom. Focal length equates to zoom. Focal length, though, in the camera world gets measured out by millimeters. And I've been asked about this a couple times. Does that stand for the distance? And no, I don't really understand the mathematics for how they've picked these numbers to how they equate. But the smaller the number, the more wide of an angle you're going to get. The higher the number, the more inwards you're going to get, and the more you're going to cut the frame down. So 70, you get this wide angle of the bird sitting on this swamp little area, and you can see the whole background, the sky, everything. As you move to 105, you're losing more of the blue of the water, and you're losing more of the greens naturally there. As you get to 200, now you've got more of the mountain range in the background, and then you've got the, the greenery. But then as you get to 400, now you've really cropped everything out, and your depth of field has changed dramatically. That background looks like it's much closer now than it was before. So focal length equates to zoom. The focal length can differ depending on how you move up. And as you move, your background to foreground relationship and your composition of the image is going to change slightly based on the lens size. And I got this little video that kind of shows a little of that. So as we look at this portrait, we can see that number one, the lower the number on this, the skinnier the boy's face looks. So we start to get this kind of weird perspective on there where the nose comes forward, the eyes come forward, and we get this needle head.
It's pretty weird.
It is weird. But then as we start to get this bigger number on there, the face becomes more plump, it becomes more symmetrical, it becomes the standard face shape that we're used to with humans. But what becomes bigger? The tree in the background. The depth of field changes dramatically based on the image. The kid doesn't move. This guy does not move anywhere. He stays in one spot. But by changing the millimeter on the lens, by changing the focal length size, we're going to see him in a different perspective. And we're also going to see our background in a different perspective. So he doesn't move once. The background only appears to move forward based on the lens. So that's how we change on our depth of field and background to foreground separation. As we're focusing in, the main focus is him, and he's closer, But that background's forced perspective is going to make it look like the background's getting even closer when it's not. Now, common lenses. You're going to see lenses all over the place. These are the ones that I would say are the most common, and then we'll talk about the ones that I believe everybody needs to start with. So, first thing you're going to notice is a kit lens. Kit lens comes with any camera body that you get as a kit. If you buy body only, typically you're buying a higher end camera that's body only, and then they will give you, the entry level cameras, or maybe mid-tier level cameras, or maybe hobbyist, or let's say intermediate cameras with a kit lens. Kit lens is a great way to get started. Typically it's going to be an all-purpose lens, so in this case 18 to 55. That's a wide angle to a portrait lens, I would say. But it's maximum aperture, and that's the number right next to everything, so it's that 3.5 to 5.6 G. Now, the 3.5 to 5.6 is referring to its maximum aperture. So as we're using this kit lens at 18 millimeters, we're going to get the aperture of 3.5 as the maximum aperture we can get. So when we talked earlier about that 2.8 or that 1.4, that background blur, we're probably not going to be able to achieve that with this lens. Now, the other thing that makes this lens cheaper and more of a kit lens is as we move towards 55, that lens is now going to change. Its maximum aperture is going to move from 3.5 to 5.6. So when you move to 55 millimeters and you get to a more portrait setting on this lens, you're no longer at 3.5. Now your maximum, or the lowest you can go, is 5.6. So now you're really not going to get any background blur. That's the glass quality that you're paying for. That's the kit lens kind of purpose. It's not meant to be your permanent end lens, but it's meant to be your guiding kind of beginning stance. Nifty 50 or prime? So to answer your question earlier, yes. Most film cameras, most video cameras, for the longest time, 50 was the one that you would see on there. And the reason being is that 50 is considered what our human eye sees at. So a 50 millimeter is the human eye. I think that every photographer should have a 50 millimeter lens. A 50 millimeter lens, nifty 50, it kind of does everything. And you can get these lenses now all the way down to 1.2. So you can get the best background blur, the best detail you've ever seen out of a lens with a nifty 50, in my opinion. I also like the nifty 50 too because it's a good kind of everyday or all-purpose lens. It's not necessarily going to be the best for, maybe architecture or landscape photography, but as far as candid shots, everyday photography, family, friends, even events, if you're doing something that doesn't require a lot of scenery, it's more of just like you and friends or you and your loved ones, this would be a great lens for that because it really does capture all of that in good detail, but without really sacrificing the crop factor of the image. Where then that can be a little bit different would be a telephoto or a zoom lens. Now this is going to be a non-singular lens. So I kept talking about the nifty 50, but on the other side of it, there's a prime. Prime lenses can be anything that has a single number. So 35 millimeter prime, 85 millimeter prime. Canon makes an 800 millimeter prime. You can find a 105 millimeter prime, 28 millimeter prime, 14 millimeter, etc. It's a singular number with the lowest, usually maximum f-stop possible, which would be a 1.2, 1.4, or 1.8. On the flip side of that, you have a telephoto. Now, in the world of telephoto, the lowest you can go on a maximum f-stop is 2.8. That would be the highest quality glass, at least on a consumer level, that you'll see unless you're maybe going to a specialty lens shop or maybe more of these cinematic lens stops where I believe they can go a smidge lower. But regardless, the zoom or telephoto lenses are great because they offer you the ability to change your millimeter or your zoom rate depending.
So, if I had the zoom and I set it on 50 millimeter, would it be about just as good as the other single?
Yes and no.
50?
Depends. If you have a really nice prime that shoots all the way down to 1.4, 1.8, 1.2, you won't possibly be able to get that on your telephoto because the lowest a telephoto can go would be 2.8. So if background separation, bokeh, blur, if you're trying to get that main focus on the subject matter and get rid of the rest of it, but like really get rid of the rest, You're only going to accomplish that with a prime lens. That's at a 1.2, 1.4, 1.8. When we move to the zoom, what I like about these is that 2.8 is always going to be there if that's the best one that you got. If not, if you got a variable one, whatever have you can work with it. I like this telephoto specifically because you can change your composition without having to physically move yourself. When you have a prime lens, if you don't like the way that it looks in the camera viewfinder, you gotta move. You gotta go right, left, further back, further forward in order to change the composition. With this, it's just as simple as twisting. The 24 to 70 millimeter lens, I think, is one that every person who uses a camera should have. If I had only one lens to have on my camera for the rest of my life, that would be the one.
Why don't you show me this one?
Yeah. Which I got. Oh, that's because that's a really good lens. The reason I like the 24 to 70 though is because it is a wide angle to a portrait. You get a little extra oomph on the portrait, but if you like a little more telephoto, it's not necessarily going to be the best for zoom. So zooming wise, this is nice if you've got that wide angle to portrait, but anything past that, you're going to want to go for a higher telephoto. They do make 24 to 105. They do make, 70 to 200s in the telephoto ones. You can go all the way up with them. They just get expensive and more expensive. A lot of glass. Prime versus zoom. Prime lens, you get the lower aperture numbers. You're going to get the singular numbers. Better blur on photos, better background to foreground association. Downside to prime lenses, you got to move around in order to get the composition that you want. Zoom lenses, downside, they can't go any lower than 2.8, and even if they, even at 2.8, it's a very expensive lens that you're looking at. They're some of the best, highest quality glass lenses out there because of all the components on the inside. But benefit to that, you can change the composition by zooming, by changing that. You have a much more wider reach on the camera as far as what you're able to get composition-wise. And if you go all the way to 2.8 and you have a zoom lens, the amount of detail you can get as you start to zoom is pretty incredible. Last lens I talk about, which I don't recommend a lot, is the travel lens. Only reason I don't recommend it is typically when you find one of these for your camera brand, you will only find it in a crop sensor. You usually don't make these for full frame because it's a cheapy lens. Lens itself can cost anywhere, I'd say, between about $500 to $800, depending on what brand you're looking at. But what makes these awesome is that they go from a very low number to a very high number. It's an all-in-one experience. So if you're going on safari to Africa and it's going to be a bright and sunny for all of the days that you're there, this is probably going to be more than enough for you. You're not necessarily going to get any good background blur. If you look at the lens and you read the fine writing, it's a 3.5 to 5.6. But as far as not having to change lenses, bring all this cumbersome gear, but also be able to bring your camera, which has maybe a better better quality than your phone or your point and shoot camera or anything else, this is a great lens to have.
What does it go up to?
That one should go all the way up to, I believe, 200. That should be an 18 to 135.
So compact.
It's a small one. It's a crop sensor, so there's not a lot of glass that needs to be in there. So once it goes onto the camera, I mean, it's probably about that big right now. And then once it fully extends, it probably extends out to there. So the barrel does come out pretty far. Again, you don't get a good aperture with it, or you're not going to get a very high aperture, I should say, with it. So it's going to be maybe to some a crummy lens, but for traveling purposes, for not having to switch between stuff, if you can kind of fudge the lighting situation, you probably could get away with this lens. And if you're really not focused on getting, a heavily blurred background with any of your shots, this will be more than enough.
So this is one of the four?
This is one of the four types, I would really say. You got the kit lens that you're going to see. That's one of the cheaper lenses. You can see macro lenses. There's VR lenses. You can get fancy with all of them. Sure. But the four typical lenses that you're going to see on the market are going to be a kit lens of some sort, the prime lenses, so the singular numbers. You're going to see telephoto lenses, and then you're going to see your kind of travel lenses, your all-in-one purpose lenses. typically, the three that I would recommend the most, what lenses do you actually need? They consider this the Trinity. So the Trinity consists of a 50mm prime, so a nifty 50, a prime lens ideally. It doesn't have to necessarily be 50. Some people, like one of my travel cameras, I use only a 35mm lens on it. 35mm lens gets me a good portrait of my subject if I want it, but it can also do a kind of a wider angle, so I can get a good kind of wide angle shot. 24 to 70, that's my everyday. I like that lens the most. It gets good wide angle, good portrait, and it's a smaller compact lens, not overly large. That's one of my favorites. Going down 70 to 200, that's the last one in the list. Now, I don't always recommend this to people because I don't think they need it 90% of the time. You have to have a very specific need for a zoom lens like this. My example are my birders. I get a lot of people that love birding. They love taking photos of birds. They want a lens like that because if they get a bird or an owl or anything that's in the distance, if they move or rustle or anything changes, they could fly off. So they need the distance on their lenses to get that image. I was in Seattle about 2 years ago, and we were climbing up one of the mountains, and in the distance was a cargo ship that was getting ready to dock. My lens at the time, I only had my 18 to 55 because I was using crop sensor lens, which is equivalent to the 24 to 70. When I got up to that 55, it was giving me enough on the frame that I could make out what it is, but it wasn't enough information or enough that I could crop into without making it blurry. So I didn't get a very clear image of that boat because I couldn't get the distance on the lens. So 70 to 200, great for somebody who needs the distance for more, let's say, wildlife shots or long distance shots. And that is all I got for you.
Is it good enough for a safari?
It would absolutely be. It might be a little overkill though, because if you're on a safari and you got something that's close up, that might be where it's a kind of a pain in the butt, because then now you got the 70, that's the lowest that you can go. So now you got to position yourself backwards more to get that shot. So it's nice, but you might see yourself switching lenses in between lenses. And that is all I got for this one. So next week will be the one that you've already attended. It'll be advanced photography again. Okay. But if you'd like to come, by all means, I don't know when do you go on your... Yeah. This is more about photo editing, so you might get more information out of this one, especially with some of the questions that you were asking, especially JPEG RAW. That gets talked about in this one.
Yeah, that was very helpful.
That one, good.
RAW.
That one, I feel like, especially once you get to that point, it's important to know that. Again, for me, if I'm on vacation, I'm shooting in JPEG. If I'm doing more of like an actual shoot where I have to present images to somebody, I'll shoot in RAW. When I forward them the file, I have to convert it to JPEG or smaller. Yeah. But
yeah. Why even on vacation? Why not shoot in
I just don't want to have to edit it later. I just don't want to have to go through the process. That's my personal. For me too, the way I set my my vacation camera, it's meant to shoot like film. So
that's your Fuji.
That's my Fuji.
So you got it all set.
Exactly. So for me, I don't really. The people I'm taking photos for and how I'm taking the photos, they don't really want me to play with the color at all. They like how it comes out of the camera because it has that film look. Like I have an example. Let me see. Find a good example that shows off the color here. So this is one that I got while I was on the beach with the camera. Mm-hmm. So the colors themselves look fine. Nothing really looks too washed out. You can see the separation, but the thing that I like about it is as soon as you start to zoom in, that's where you can start to really see the color and how it not becomes grainy or pixelated. It starts to become sandy. It reminds me a lot of that film. The colors themselves too aren't very saturated. Mm-hmm. So like the red on his shorts was very vibrant. Even the green on the jet ski should have been much more vibrant, but it feels more muted and brought back given my camera. Mm-hmm. So I try to shoot on that specifically to get that type of kind of
Gotcha.
control. So with the JPEGs and the RAW, it can get a little complicated, but I always recommend start with JPEG, get a feel for it. That way it's already done, taken care of, and then as soon as you start to feel like you're ready to explore, RAW is really nice. It takes up more in file size on the SD card, but there's so much you can do with it to really bring out so many features on there. I keep thinking of that one you showed me of the green inflatable guy, the pickle guy, and the first photo, vibrant, everything was great, and then we looked back at the original and you could just see how muted that green was.
Right.
But I mean, again, just changing the tints or the temperature on that photo or any of that just slightly can really drastically change the color composition. Yeah. Well, that's all I got for you. I took you all the way to 7, so sorry I made it an hour and a half this time. But do we have any questions for you guys? Anything I can answer?
I've got questions about how to use this. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I don't know if I'm bore you or whatever. When I'm in the P mode, it seems like my color is pretty dull. When I switch it to auto, I get much better color.
Let's see. Do you have an example?
On the camera?
Yeah, let's see.
Yeah. Right.
So you're saying on P mode, so
The program.
program mode.
Trying to
Is that
think.
an auto program?
Yeah, it would be an auto program, but you can change things on there. So maybe there's something that's not running that is running on auto.
Let's see. I don't know. You know, here. Let's see. Well, here, right there. There's the P mode. There's the auto mode.
Okay.
Right, and I'm getting much better color.
On the auto.
Yeah.
So if you click on this, what I would recommend, hit the play, hit the, let's see, display. There we go. So there's your information on there. So right now ISO is 100. It was at 57 millimeters. It did an f4 with a 1 200 of a second shutter. We'll go over to the next one. So here's the washed out one.
Yeah.
So 1 1/80th of a second, so it was much faster. So that makes sense. So the speed on this camera, when you're in program auto, let's see. That makes sense. When you're in program auto, right now you're not on auto shutter. So it's gonna just do whatever the shutter speed was from the
When I'm on program, it's program auto.
When you're on, you can set it to, you can program it to then be auto in certain areas if you want, but you have to set it that way. Right now, the way you have it set in program auto, it's just going to give you whatever, you have to control your speed over here.
Fine.
Yeah. So you can change that.
So I'm better off shooting right now in auto.
Exactly. Once you get more comfortable,
Alright.
but if you like it, here, let's see. Let's go program auto, let's go FM.
Is there an advantage to using the viewfinder as opposed to the monitor?
No. There's really no advantage that I can think of, and I've asked other people about this too if they have an opinion. No. It's all based on personal preference. When I'm shooting, I find it that if I'm doing video, I like to use my screen a little bit more because I can pan down, I can get a better angle. If there's not a lot of sun or blockage, I also like to shoot like this because I used to have an old film camera where you could remove the top there and then see the mirrors in action. So I used to like doing that just for like a more of a dip shot. But I would say that if I've got a lot of sun coming in, the suction cup that comes around here really does block the rest of the sun out. So if I've got a very bright day or the sun's on my back,
As you're moving around, I would think you'd want the viewfinder too,
it's
right?
nice. Yeah. So I don't have a preference on it. I basically go with how what my environment looks like.
So, how do I save? If I take a picture and I use the AF on autofocus. Let's see here. What do I say here? Let me take a bring this up. I want to be able to this is a stupid thing. Every time I turn the camera on, I have to tell it English. Can they remember that or no?
Oh yeah, they should. Every time you turn it on.
Every time I turn it on, they ask me what language you want, what's the date.
Here, let me
So if we could make that go away, so if it's so smart,
That'd drive you crazy.
well, it does. If it's so smart, kid just it's English, and I don't even put the date in there. Just delete all of it, right? So I don't have to answer that every time I turn the camera on.
Hold on. That's really strange. That should just automatically save once it's been set. It shouldn't. Let me turn it off.
They're doing that for you too?
Let's see. Okay, no, I think that's weird. All right, I just turned it on and off. Okay, it looks like it's good now.
Okay, you fixed that.
Yeah.
Um,
So go ahead.
So, all right, here's the other thing. So, if I've got a picture, right, and I want to zoom in on something,
Yep.
right? And I want to, oops. Let's see, how do we make it?
Smaller.
Open it up. No, I was going to open it up. All right. How do I save that image?
You crop it on the computer. I don't.
So I can't do it on the camera?
Let me see. Let me see.
I thought I like on the Nikon you can save it,
Let's see.
which I in the Nikon I find that is a really nice feature that I can kind of edit and play around the pictures right on the camera. You know what I'm talking
No,
about?
yeah. I've never done that myself before. I remember it being a feature on one of the cyber shots that Sony had, but I don't remember. Maybe not that, but there's got to be one that does it. Let me Google that for you. Let me see if I can get an answer with that. Let me turn this off because nobody's asking any questions and I don't have any viewers.
Fine.
And let me Google that real quick.
I'm curious. That's kind of, for me, that's an important because I like to, you're sitting on a plane coming back from somewhere and you're playing around with your camera and you go, oh, if there's something really good over here, let me zoom in and I'll save that as a separate picture.
Guys, have a great night. Thanks for being on the class. If anybody has any questions, comments, or concerns, my phone number, email are on there. Feel free to reach out anytime.
So